Every empire that has ever tried to negotiate from a position of sudden tariff shock has ended up conceding more than it gained, every single one, without exception. And I want to argue today, using game theory and structural history, that Canada is about to make the same mistake unless it understands the trap it is already walking into. Let me go back, because I think it is important to understand how we got here. In 2023, when the mainstream consensus was that the USMCA was stable and the US-Canada relationship was the most durable trade partnership in the world, I made 4 predictions in this classroom. Prediction 1. The Trump administration would use tariffs not as a final outcome, but as a continuous negotiating weapon. Prediction 2. Canada would make unilateral concessions in exchange for promises that would not be kept. Prediction 3. Mexico would be played against Canada in a wedge strategy to extract better terms from both. Prediction 4. The USMCA review process, set for 2026, would become the central battleground. 3 of those 4 predictions have already come true. I did not make those predictions because I am special. I made them because I used a method, a framework. I call it predictive history, using game theory and structural patterns from history to understand where things are going. And today I want to use that same framework to tell you why Canada's current negotiating strategy is structurally flawed, why the Trump administration will not give Canada what it wants, and what Canada must do in the next 12 months to avoid a decade of managed decline. So how do I make predictions? I look at 3 things. First, I look at structure, the deep structural forces shaping a situation: geography, population, economics. These things do not change quickly. They constrain what is possible. Second, I look at incentives. In game theory, every player is trying to maximize their own interest. So I ask, what does each player actually want? Not what they say they want, what they actually want. Because those 2 things are almost always different. Third, I look at history. Not because history repeats exactly. It does not. But because human beings are human beings. Empires are empires. Certain patterns appear again and again across thousands of years. If you know those patterns, you can see them playing out right now. So let us look at the players. What does the Trump administration say it wants? They say they want fair trade. They say they want to close the trade deficit with Canada. They say they want Canada to open its dairy market, regulate American technology companies less aggressively, and accept the USMCA review on American terms. Now, what does the Trump administration actually want? The evidence is clear. The Trump administration wants political wins it can broadcast to its domestic base before the 2026 midterms. It wants Canada to be seen publicly capitulating. It wants the story to be, we were tough, they folded, American workers won. The specific policy content of any deal matters far less than the optics of dominance. This is why every time Canada makes a concession, the digital services tax, the retaliatory tariff rollback, the Trump side does not reciprocate. It escalates, because the goal is not equilibrium. The goal is submission. What does Canada say it wants? Canada's Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc has been very clear. Canada wants a comprehensive deal, not one-off concessions. A broad agreement that eases tariff pressure on affected sectors and provides certainty around the USMCA review process. Now, what does Canada actually want? Canada wants to stop the bleeding. Canada's economy is deeply integrated with the American economy. Roughly 75% of Canadian exports go to the United States. Canadian politicians cannot survive an extended tariff war with their largest trading partner. The comprehensive deal framing is not strategy. It is a defensive posture designed to limit further unilateral extraction. Canada wants to lock any concessions inside a larger package so that it cannot be picked apart piece by piece. That is smart. But it may be too late. What does Mexico say it wants? Mexico says it wants USMCA stability. It says it wants to protect its manufacturing sector, particularly in the automotive and electronics industries, from tariff disruption. Now, what does Mexico actually want? Mexico wants to be the last man standing in North American trade. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer has already confirmed that talks with Mexico are further advanced than talks with Canada. Mexico's Economy Minister Marcelo Ebrard is about to visit Ottawa. Mexico is playing both sides. It is sharing information with Canada while simultaneously moving closer to a bilateral deal with Washington. If Mexico signs first, Canada loses its leverage entirely. This is not paranoia. This is the oldest play in triangular negotiation theory. Okay, I have the players and their real interests. Now let us look at the structural realities. Structural fact number one. Canada's export dependency is asymmetric and irreversible on a short timeline. Approximately 75% of Canadian merchandise exports go to the United States. The equivalent figure for American exports going to Canada is approximately 17%. I want you to understand something. This is not a trade relationship between equals. This is a relationship between a large economy that can absorb disruption and a smaller economy that cannot survive it. Canada sells almost everything it makes to one customer. That customer knows it. The math simply does not work in Canada's favor in a prolonged standoff. Every month this continues, Canadian industries, steel, aluminum, automotive, energy absorb costs that American industries do not. Structural fact number two, Canada has already demonstrated its concession threshold. In June 2025, Canada dropped its digital services tax at the Trump administration's request. Weeks later, Trump raised tariffs anyway. Canada then dropped many of its retaliatory measures while negotiations were ongoing. Then Trump broke off negotiations entirely. Let me say that again. Canada made two unilateral concessions. It received nothing in return, both times. In game theory, when a player repeatedly cooperates after being defected against, the other player learns that defection is costless. Canada has now trained the Trump administration to expect concessions without reciprocity. This is not my opinion. This is one of the most well-established findings in repeated game theory. Structural fact number three. The USMCA review is structurally weighted against Canada. The USMCA review process, scheduled for 2026, requires all three parties to agree to continue. The Trump administration has made clear it views the review as an opportunity to renegotiate terms, not simply to renew them. American trade officials have flagged Canada's supply-managed dairy system, a sector protected by legislation passed unanimously by Canada's parliament last year, as a target. Canada cannot concede on dairy without a domestic political crisis. But refusing to concede on dairy gives the Trump administration a pretext to block the review entirely. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Canada is boxed in on its most politically sensitive file. Structural fact number four. Mexico's accelerating track is compressing Canada's timeline to near zero. Greer has announced he is traveling to Mexico City on April 20th to continue bilateral discussions. Mexico has a bilateral deal within reach. If Mexico signs before Canada, the entire architecture of USMCA trilateralism collapses into two bilateral relationships, one American-Mexican relationship with momentum and one American-Canadian relationship frozen at square one. History is very clear about what happens to the last party in a triangular negotiation. The question is not whether Canada faces a worse deal if Mexico moves first. The question is how much worse. I believe this situation ends in one of two ways, and which way it ends depends on one critical question. Can Canada change its negotiating posture before Mexico signs a bilateral framework with Washington? Scenario 1. Canada's comprehensive deal strategy succeeds. Here is what that looks like step by step. Canada holds its position through April and May. Mexico's talks with Washington stall on automotive content rules, a genuinely complex issue where Mexican and American interests diverge. The Trump administration, facing midterm pressure and needing a North American trade story, invites Canada back to a trilateral table. Canada, Mexico, and the United States negotiate a modified USMCA framework that gives the Trump administration visible wins on dairy access and technology regulation in exchange for tariff relief on Canadian steel and aluminum and USMCA certainty through 2030. Mark Carney's government claims a comprehensive victory. The Trump administration claims it forced Canada to open its markets. Both sides have something to show domestically. This is the best case path. It requires Mexico's talks to stall. It requires the Trump administration to need a win more than it needs to humiliate Canada. Neither of those conditions is guaranteed. Scenario 2. Mexico signs first, and here is why this scenario is more likely. Mexico's talks are further advanced. Ebrard is visiting Ottawa not to coordinate strategy, but to signal to Canada that Mexico is moving. Once Mexico signs a bilateral framework, even a partial one, the Trump administration has no structural incentive to offer Canada a comprehensive deal. Canada becomes the one remaining holdout. American officials will frame Canada's position as stubbornness. Domestic Canadian industries under tariff pressure will begin lobbying their own government to accept whatever terms Washington offers. The supply management legislation will come under parliamentary attack. LeBlanc's comprehensive deal framework collapses into exactly the one-off concessions Canada said it would not accept. Canada ends up with tariff relief on steel and aluminum, a partial opening of dairy markets, new technology regulation commitments, and no binding certainty on the USMCA review. It is a worse deal than Canada could have negotiated 6 months ago, and it comes after 2 years of economic pain. Now here are my 3 specific predictions. Prediction 1. Canada will make a concession on dairy before the end of 2026. Not the full opening the Trump administration is demanding. The legislation makes that politically impossible. But a carve-out, a quota expansion, something that can be framed as progress without triggering a full parliamentary battle. Canada will dress it up as a technical adjustment. The Trump administration will call it a major win. Both statements will be partially true. Prediction 2. Within 12 to 24 months, Canada and the United States will have a bilateral framework agreement that is smaller in scope than either side publicly claims. It will cover tariff relief on specific commodity sectors, new commitments on technology regulation, and a modified dairy access arrangement. It will not resolve the fundamental asymmetry in the relationship. It will not provide the USMCA certainty that Canadian businesses actually need, but it will be signed, and both governments will hold press conferences. Prediction 3. The long-term consequence of this decade of tariff disruption will be that Canada begins slowly, reluctantly, with enormous domestic resistance to diversify its trade relationships. Not away from the United States, that is structurally impossible in the short term, but toward a more serious posture with the European Union, the Indo-Pacific, and bilateral relationships with Australia, Japan, and South Korea. This is what the Trump tariff era actually produces in the long run. It does not weaken North American integration as much as it accelerates Canadian trade diversification. The irony is that Trump's pressure may produce exactly the more independent Canada that successive Canadian governments lack the political will to build on their own. Let me address the questions I know you are asking. Question 1. Is Canada's demand for a comprehensive deal a real strategy or just a stalling tactic? I am confident that it is both simultaneously. LeBlanc's framing that Canada will not accept one-off concessions without a broader agreement is a genuine strategic position designed to prevent further extraction. But it is also a way of managing domestic politics during a period when Canada cannot deliver visible progress. The problem is that the Trump administration does not negotiate comprehensive deals on partner timelines. It creates deadlines and harvests concessions under pressure. Canada's comprehensive deal strategy is sound in theory and fragile in practice. Question 2. Can Canada actually hold its position on supply management? The answer is no, and here is why. The legislation passed unanimously by Parliament is a real constraint, but legislation can be amended. And when Canadian dairy farmers are competing with American dairy products entering under a tariff-reduced regime, and when the automotive sector is hemorrhaging jobs, Parliament will look at that unanimous vote differently. Supply management will survive this round. It will not survive the next 5 years unchanged. Question 3. Is the Canada-US relationship permanently damaged? I am confident that the institutional relationship is not permanently damaged. The economic integration is too deep. The geographic reality does not change, but the psychological relationship between the two governments, the assumption of good faith, the expectation of reciprocity, the idea that the US-Canada partnership is somehow different from ordinary great power relationships, that is gone, and it will not return regardless of who wins the next American election. Let me close with a historical analogy. In 1842, the British Empire and the United States signed the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, resolving a series of border disputes between the US and British Canada. The British were the declining partner in that negotiation. They had just come off the humiliation of the Opium War and needed stability on their North American frontier more than the Americans did. The British negotiator Lord Ashburton gave up territory, gave up rights, gave up leverage because Britain needed the deal more than America did. The Americans walked away with the largest share of the disputed territories. History, as always, does not forgive those who ignore its lessons. Lord Ashburton is Canada right now. Not because Canada is weak. Canada is not weak. But because Canada needs this deal more than the United States does, and the Trump administration knows it, and Canada's negotiators know that the Trump administration knows it. This is the trap. The comprehensive deal strategy is Canada's attempt to escape the Ashburton dynamic, to refuse to be the desperate partner. That instinct is correct. The question is whether Canada has the time, the political will, and the Mexican buffer it needs to execute it. Canada is one Mexico deal away from losing everything it is trying to protect. One deal. That is the margin. That is my analysis for today. Remember, this is not prophecy. This is game theory and structural history. It might be wrong, but if I am wrong, we will come back and analyze why. That is what this class is about.